On April 26, 2014, construction crews in the New Mexico desert brought in heavy machinery to break through a thick slab of concrete. They weren't digging for water, or oil, or ancient fossils. They were digging for video games. Hundreds of spectators and documentary film crews had gathered here in Alamogordo to see if a very specific piece of modern folklore was actually real. For over 30 years, an urban legend circulated that in the dead of night, gaming giant Atari had secretly buried millions of unsold copies of a single title, often called the worst game ever made. As the excavators pulled crushed, dirt-covered cartridges from the rubble, they proved the myth was true. These unearthed items serve as a literal time capsule, revealing how the company that built the video game industry triggered its own catastrophic, near-total collapse. To understand the collapse, we have to go back to 1972. Atari started out in the arcades, testing their very first electronic simulation of table tennis, Pong, in a California tavern. By 1977, they figured out how to shrink those bulky arcade cabinets down to fit in a living room, releasing the Atari Video Computer System, later known as the Atari 2600. The 2600 changed how home hardware functioned. Instead of a machine locked to a single built-in game, Atari designed a system that accepted interchangeable ROM cartridges. When Atari started licensing huge arcade hits like Asteroids and Space Invaders to play on the system, hardware sales quadrupled. They proved the concept of a killer app, a piece of software so desirable that it forces consumers to buy the hardware to play it. During this golden era, Atari didn't need to fight for market share. In the minds of the global public, the Atari brand name was entirely synonymous with video games. That total dominance created a vulnerability. Independent third-party developers soon discovered how to bypass Atari's console locking mechanisms, allowing them to publish and sell their own 2600 games without Atari's permission. This graph shows the volume of new game releases versus actual consumer demand. Without quality control, you see an explosive spike of unplayable titles flooding the market. As this data point shows, Atari themselves made it worse. To capitalize on the most popular arcade property in the world, they rushed a highly anticipated home port of Pac-Man to market. The game sold millions on brand recognition alone, but the final product was glitchy and unpleasant to look at. Consumers rejected it, triggering waves of retail returns. With retail shelves overflowing with knockoff titles and Atari's own flagship games failing to function, consumer trust evaporated. The market was completely oversaturated, creating a highly fragile environment. The final blow arrived in 1982. Atari's parent company, Warner Communications, paid $21 million just for the licensing rights to make a game based on Steven Spielberg's massive cinematic hit, E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial. The corporate negotiations dragged on for so long that they only left the game's sole programmer, Howard Scott Warshaw, 5 weeks to design, code, and test the entire project before the crucial Christmas shipping deadline. The rushed development cycle resulted in a confusing, frustrating mess. Players spent almost all of their time falling into deep, inescapable pits with no clear instructions on how to levitate out of them. Atari had manufactured 4 million copies expecting a sellout. Instead, the game's reputation caused millions of those cartridges to bounce right back from retailers. Within a year, North American video game revenues collapsed by 97%. With nowhere to sell their inventory and warehouses overflowing from a collapsed market, Atari loaded a fleet of semi-trucks and quietly drove millions of dead cartridges to a municipal dump. When the excavators finally cracked that concrete shell in 2014, they did find the truth, but they also corrected a few historical exaggerations. They didn't find 5 million copies of E.T. Experts estimated there were roughly 700,000 items buried there, and it was a mixed cross-section of total systemic failure: unsold copies of Pac-Man, Centipede, broken joysticks, and prototype hardware. The burial served as a standard corporate write-off for excess inventory. It was a logistical solution for a giant that could no longer afford to store its own mistakes. Atari never fully recovered their dominance. Despite attempting several hardware pivots over the next decade, like the technically impressive but commercially flawed Lynx handheld, they officially exited the console market in 1996. But the story of the landfill has a strange postscript. The city of Alamogordo took about 800 of those recovered, crushed games and auctioned them online, raising over £80,000. Other cartridges were carefully preserved and donated to global institutions like the Smithsonian. After spending 30 years suffocating in dirt and concrete, these pieces of plastic were elevated to historical artifacts. Corporate hubris and impossible deadlines nearly destroyed interactive entertainment before it really began. But in doing so, Atari turned a rushed 5-week commercial failure into a permanent, undeniable artifact of human history.